Welcome to our first episode of Winging It, a show about design, development, and our approach to solving problems. At Oddbird, we enjoy connecting with others in our industry, and we decided this might be a great place to teach, learn, and continue those types of conversations. But before we begin, I'd love to introduce us. He is an avid Python and Django developer with a focus on performance, security, and accessibility. He participates in spaces built around open source software as a contributor and speaker. Let's welcome to the show, Ed Rivas.
Glad to be here.
Excellent. An Oddbird co-founder, core contributor to the Sass language, and invited expert on the W3C CSS working group, she proposed adding layers to the Cascade and then helped write the specification. Delighted to have her on our very first episode. Welcome, Miriam Suzanne.
Hey, thanks. Great to be here.
And after 20 short years in the industry, I still love all things design, UI development. I enjoy experimenting with new tools, setting up as many automations as I can, and teaching, speaking, discussing design and front-end development at meetups and conferences. My name is Stacy Cavermo, and I'm also glad to be here. For our inaugural show, we thought we could start with a topic that is near and dear to our hearts, CSS Cascade Layers. If you've ever found yourself in a specificity war, you'll understand how important having control over style priority can be. During our conversation, we'll discuss what CSS layers are and how you may use them in your project. But before we jump into CSS layers, we want to pull back and learn about some of the exciting new developments and possibilities in CSS in a quick release radar segment. Miriam, could you tell us about the new features and techniques that are shaping the future of web development and why we are excited about them?
Oh boy, there is so much happening right now that it's hard to pick one thing. But there's also, I think, when I was thinking through this, there's nothing new behind the scenes. Everything that I know of that's coming out is already being talked about. People are playing with it. There's prototypes. Some of the things have already landed. We've got the has selector, colors, cascade layers, container queries. Nesting even has released in all the browsers. And there's going to be more changes coming with all of that and sort of more power. But there's nothing sort of secret like that we need to start thinking about coming out soon. It's all landing. And I think maybe we're at a place where we need to settle into some things that we're starting to get and really figure out what they mean for us. How do they change what we're writing, how we're writing CSS?
I've never heard a developer say, whoa, 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 we don't want any new features. Like the web is good enough. So that's exciting.
I don't know if that's where we're at, but it feels like, geez, we have to figure out what all this means. And also, in some cases, like our topic today, like Cascade Layers, in some cases, they're hard to pick up with progressive enhancement. And so we have to think carefully about how long we wait before we're using them in production, which is going to be a different answer for different people. But
yeah, I think you are right. I'm just thinking of all the different clients and all their specifications of which browsers they want to support, and there's so many options now, and it's just a matter of which do you start incorporating now and which do you hold off on. The browser support seems so good for most of these things.
Yeah, and that's sort of like if you get support in all the major modern browsers, evergreen browsers, that's something like 96% support globally. And then you just have to ask yourself, what about that 4%? Is there a way to ship a simpler style that works? Are there polyfills? What's the approach for handling that last little bit?
Absolutely. Well, I don't think we should delay anymore because I know what all the people came to see today. on our very first episode of a show they've never heard before. But I'm so excited to hear all about CSS layers from you, Miriam. And while we could have just had this conversation during one of our stand-ups at Oddbird, we thought, why not record it and show everyone how amazing all these new things are. So can you first tell us more about the Cascade and why is it important in CSS?
Yeah, was that a pun?
No.
Why it's important?
No. Oh.
Oh.
No, I didn't even notice that. Exclamation important.
Yeah, the Cascade is sort of fundamental to the whole problem of CSS, or what it's here for. If we are trying to select things on a page from outside of the page, we need some way of saying, I want to style a button, and grab that button and be able to apply styles to it. But as soon as we're doing that from the outside, that means we've got selectors, right? So the selectors let us grab the button and do something to it. But as soon as we can do that, we can grab the button twice from different places, and we could apply 16 different background colors to our button. And one of those has to win. So the Cascade is just saying there are a cascade of styles, and one has to override all the others. So we need some sort of algorithm mechanism for determining which background we applied to the button. And that's it. It has to be there. It's somewhat fundamental. But then that expands out into asking lots of questions about, well, how do we want to choose a winner? Which starts with a question about where is the style coming from? Is it coming from web authors? That's us writing our brand styles for a site. Or is it coming from the browsers that are providing sort of universal defaults? Or is it coming from users that have preferences and needs about what they can see, what can fit on their screen? So there's all sorts of questions about how a style should be weighted based on where it comes from, based on how important it is to somebody. That's where we get the bang important. And then we get other things like, what context is it in? If it's in the shadow DOM, that changes things. Is it in the HTML directly? An element attached style has priority over styles coming from outside. Now Cascade Layers, but then also specificity is sort of a rough guess that the more specific we are about what we're selecting, the more we probably care about that. So we're going to do global defaults that are broadly selected, and then we're going to select things narrowly to override that. So that's sort of a heuristic guess, and it works okay in a lot of cases, and it doesn't always work. And then the final thing that the Cascade looks at is the order of the styles, and the last one wins if everything else is equal.
Yeah, and I like that you mentioned specificity, because I remember that is like a big problem in many, especially when designs grow. So, and I know that Cascade Layers is the newest maybe solution to those kind of problems. But could you share like a historic rundown of alternatives, or what people consider good or best practices in the past, or maybe for many are going to be current best practices to deal with the Cascade and specificity?
Yeah, well, one of the things with specificity, and Stacy, you could jump in here too. You've been doing this quite a while. With specificity, there's sort of always an escalation. It's hard to de-escalate specificity. What I mean is, if you've got a conflict and, well, let's say one of the selectors comes from outside, it's coming from Bootstrap or some other third-party tool, and you don't have access to it. They've used an ID selector, which is very powerful. Suddenly, you have to either add an ID selector to an ID to your selector to match their power, or you have to add bang important, which is sort of the trump card in CSS that jumps you even out of specificity and into a whole new world of important styles. And that's binary. So once you've added important, somebody else has to add important if they want to match you. And you can just grow and grow this escalating war of specificity, which isn't great. And people have had a lot of solutions to that. Some have said no using important ever. Some have said all specificity, all selectors should be just one class, which really limits what you can do with selectors. But it ensures that you're not escalating, and then you just worry about source order. And then, of course, that starts to get complicated when you use frameworks that are loading your CSS in components in a random order.
Would you say that, because I remember, BAM and object-oriented CSS and many of the conventions that we take for granted, would you say this managing the cascade and specificity problems is a big part of why they became popular and so widespread?
Yeah, I think so. And there's sort of an interesting history there of a range of more and more tightly controlled conventions. Like I remember in around 2008 getting really excited about CSS systems from Natalie Down, which basically said, laid out, there's three categories. There's the elements themselves, paragraphs and links and whatever, and we style those as global defaults. And then we have classes that do sort of reusable patterns, and then we have IDs that do specific components. And she sort of laid that out. And then Nicole Sullivan's CSS sort of pushed everything towards classes a little bit. And reusability, and then BEM took that even farther and made everything a single class, which was not exactly what object-oriented CSS was, but sort of constricting the same idea even more and even more. And I think, you follow that path long enough, you end up with Tailwind, utility classes, that sort of everything is just a class.
Great. Do you have any examples or demos that you could show us, like how CSS Cascade Layers would work in practice?
Yeah, let me pull one up here and share my screen.
And for our audio only audience, if you can talk through what we're seeing here, that would be amazing.
Yeah, so what I have is a code pen here with 6 buttons in 3 rows and 2 columns. There's a default button, a danger button, and an info button. And then disabled versions of each of those, supposedly. The default button is purple, the danger button is red, the info button is blue. And in my CSS, so I've got a .btn style button class that's doing the default styles there, and then a disabled class that's supposed to make the disabled buttons all a dim gray and give them the not allowed cursor, which is the cursor's showing up, but the dim gray is not, or it's only showing up on the default. And then we've got a danger button that's setting the background maroon, and an info class setting the background to blue. And those are overriding the disabled style. And this is a specificity conflict. These all have the same specificity. They're all a single class. And so one way we could fix this is to drag our disabled styles down to the end and then they win. But it feels a bit fragile to me. We're not really saying what we mean. We're not really documenting that the order of these classes matters. So the idea with layers is that we could actually be explicit about this. We could create a layer called default and move our default button styles into that. And then we could have a states layer, let's call it, and move disabled into that. So we're just trying to think about, like, what do these styles represent? And layer, I don't know what to call this. This is like the intent of the button. We can call these layers anything we want. So if you don't like these names, they can change. But then we get to say at the beginning the order that we want them to happen in. So we want default to come first, and then the intent, or maybe theme would be better. I don't know. And then we want the state to override the others. And that gives us what we want. So now instead of the order mattering, we can put the order of this code any way we want, because we've established at the very beginning what the cascade order should be. And that gives us all of our disabled buttons now in the bottom row show up with a gray background, even though disabled class is defined before the danger and info classes. And we can do this at various layers, or various levels of our project, right? So it's easiest to show a demo at a small component like a button, but we can also do this with larger things in our project. So we could say bootstrap, or we've got a reset that's the lowest layer, and then we've got bootstrap as a layer above that, and then we've got our component styles as a layer above that, and utility classes as our top layer or something. So we can define whatever layers we need for a project, and then you can also nest layers, so we can have layers inside of layers inside of layers.
And can you talk to us for a moment about what unlayered styles mean and why they are prioritized over layered styles?
Oh, yes. So we can see here, let me just add a button selector. So that's not using a class at all. That's just a button element. And if I set color to green, they all turn green. Let's see, I actually want to do background. So it's the same. They all turn green. That I just defined that not in a layer. So it is overriding all of the other styles that were in layers, which is surprising to some people and a bit dangerous. There is a reason we did that, which is there's no way to remove layers from styles. So if you're pulling in a third-party tool, like a reset, you're pulling in a reset and they've put all their code in layers, you want to be able to determine where your styles go in relation to theirs. Once they've layered, there's nothing you can do to unlayer their code. And so you want to be able to override theirs by default. And we looked into, like, maybe you define your own place to insert unlayered styles between your layers. But that also becomes very fragile if the reset made one assumption about where unlayered styles are going to go, and then you pull it into your project and you've made a different assumption about where unlayered styles are going to go, it becomes really fragile. But what this means is likely when you move to layers, you're going to want to move everything to layers and not really use unlayered styles, or use them just as a place for testing and overriding things. And then once code moves into production, it goes into a layer.
Would you recommend that like a third-party library that will always be used as something that is imported? Like, would you recommend them to like not put anything in a layer so that the people using the library could decide?
I would recommend, I think it's actually a great thing for layers. I think layers are actually a great thing for third-party tools to use. And because we've set it up this way, I think they can. The only question is about browser support and browser history. But frameworks can both use layers as an internal relationship, maintaining specificity inside of the framework. So Bootstrap can have defaults and also components, and say components override defaults internally. And the framework could expose that as part of the API. So they could say, we have a Bootstrap defaults and a Bootstrap components, and you can put styles in between those by inserting a layer between. Or you can add to one or the other of those layers with your overrides. So that might be interesting as a part of the API shipped by the third party. The other thing that they can do is wrap all their layers in an anonymous layer. You don't have to give a layer a name, but if you don't give it a name, you can't move it around or add things to it. So frameworks that don't want to expose their layers as an API could wrap all their layers in an unnamed layer and make sure it's all internal and not give you access directly. But then the nice thing is, when you pull in Bootstrap with layers, if Bootstrap has used layers and you pull it in, you can say where you want those styles to fit in your layer order. So you can nest them again. And that's why layers can be nested, so that one tool can have all its internal layers, and then you can say, yes, take all of those layers and nest them inside of my framework layer. And then I'm going to add a framework overrides layer that's going to win over all of those, or whatever you want on your project.
So to be clear, because I saw something that caught my attention, we define layers in their own @rule block, right? But then later in the style sheet, I could open a block with the same layer name, and that would be adding styles to the same layer, right?
Right.
And even if it was defined by a third party.
Right. But if you've pulled those third-party styles into a sublayer, you can avoid layer name conflicts, if that makes sense. So you could turn somebody else's layers into nested layers, and then their naming won't conflict with your naming. But yeah, it means you can keep coming back to layers and add to them from different places in your code base.
I really like the control and the clarity that they bring to the table, because as you said before, many times just moving your declaration a few lines below, right? Or if you're using something like Sass to compile, moving your imports in their order, you might be affecting the output of the compile CSS. And now you actually have changed the specificity of your styles, right? And now, yeah, you notice that one of your buttons is gray instead of green that you expected. So now I really like it, because you get to name them and you set the order yourself. So the intent is very clear, and it also gives you that control over third-party code and styles that you can slot it into the right place for your site.
Yeah, which I think gets to something interesting and maybe important as a best practice. It's good to define your layer order in one place up front. at least all the main layers, and then sub layers can be defined somewhere else if they need to be. But to have one place at the very start of your code that says how layers are going to work, you can always go check why one layer is overriding another and see where the order is set. But then, yeah, it does. It makes it possible for, say, a JavaScript framework loading component styles to load them in any order, and it doesn't matter because you've put them all in layers and they'll get slotted into the appropriate place.
And that goes into my next question, which is, and I think you already started answering this, but what are your recommendations for an existing code base, right, that wants to implement layers, that wants to bring them in? I know you mentioned maybe you put everything in layers, right, and define your layer order up front, but is there anything else that people can use if they want to migrate to this approach?
Yeah, actually, I'm going to share my screen again for this. This is a chart from Inverted Triangle CSS from Harry Roberts. He talks about the way that we currently have to organize our code base, our CSS, so that as we get farther in the code, further lines of code, we can slowly increase specificity, but we have to be careful never to get it out of order, because then order doesn't match specificity. We run into problems. And this is something that we had to do carefully without layers. And my suggestion is to basically take this idea and start at the lowest end and break off layers. So say, okay, our most generic styles, let's create a generic layer and move styles into it. And since unlayered styles override layered styles, if we start at the bottom, it's going to continue making sense. And that gives us a little bit more freedom inside of the generic styles. Now they can get more specific, and it's okay, they're contained, their specificity is contained. And we can sort of do that layer by layer, starting from the bottom. I mean, maybe it's resets before generic, whatever you name these, starting from the broadest, least important styles and working our way up. We can break off each layer and then have a little bit more freedom to play in that layer and move up through the code base until we're getting to components and utilities and whatever else. That would be my recommendation.
So I think anyone who's using a convention where you have, a conception of which styles should override others, you could very easily take those concepts that are not enforced really by CSS itself, it's just by the convention, and turn them into layers, right? And start and make an explicit contract of how specific you want to be on each layer. That's really cool. Yeah,
and the whole idea here was let's take these conventions that we've had and make them explicit, make them part of the language. It's no longer just relying on convention across our team and everybody getting it right. We can now say it, just say it and have it happen.
And I'm glad like this didn't pick a convention to enforce it. You actually let everyone enforce it on their own site, right? You can use whatever you want, as many as you want, and name them whatever you want.
Right. In some ways, I think that is just inverted triangle CSS. So in some ways, we just took that convention and put it in the browser. But yeah, it's not like now you have to use BEM syntax or you have to use some other syntax.
Yeah, I, for one, am very grateful of not having to write extra long class names.
You're welcome.
Yeah.
You still can, but...
Oh, yeah.
Totally, you can have extra long layer names and extra long class names too. Totally.
Oh yeah, we should develop conventions with underscored class or layer names and try to make this as complex as we can too.
Yeah. I think it's for those who want to start using this, one of the key concerns is going to be browser support, right? And could you tell us a little bit about what's a browser support, and then for those browsers that don't have support, are there any options that people can use?
Yeah, browser support right now is layers have been supported in all of the major modern browsers for the last 2 years, year and a half, something like
There's
that.
a few that were, I think, January of 2022, but also 2021. It's really well supported.
Yeah, it's around 90% globally. So really what you're looking at is some old Android browsers don't support it, and old versions of Internet Explorer don't support it. So if you're supporting those, you might want to either hold off a little bit, or you can check for support using JavaScript and load a different style sheet. And if you're doing that, there's a Polyfill, which some people on our team helped make. Ed, were you involved in that?
I was
no?
not. I was just observing from a distance.
Yeah, there is a Polyfill. We can link to that in the show notes. It's runs through PostCSS, and it's a little heavy-handed. The Polyfill has to be a little invasive and change all your selectors a bit to add specificity and remove specificity. But it works. So that might be a fallback that some people want. Another fallback, I mean, I remember back with IE6, we used to just ship a simple IE6 style sheet that would work on most sites and call it good. So you could do more basic fallbacks. But it is a sort of thing where if you're moving all of your styles into layers, old browsers aren't going to see any of those styles because they're going to ignore the layer rule and everything inside of it. So it's not easy to get real simple progressive enhancement here. You're going to need some heavier fallback, whether that's polyfilled or more basic styles.
So the polyfill is completely running at build time. It's not something you're shipping to the browser, right, and modifying your styles on the go.
Right. So and there's a few things in Cascade Layers that can make a difference live in the browser, and so you lose out on those features. That's basically, well, you lose out on those behaviors. I don't know if they're features, but like layer order can change based on what media queries are around and things like that. But yeah, it's all build time. So you're shipping the polyfilled CSS to everybody, or you're doing a little bit of a JavaScript check to load the polyfilled or the modern version of that CSS.
Cool. It's great knowing that there are fallbacks, and that most likely many people won't need them, right? And it's just so well supported right now. So we had so much time to develop these naming conventions and best practices around that. But what would you say are best practices in this new layered world? Anything that people should consider once they have migrated to, or while they are migrating to implement into their style sheets?
Yeah. I mean, I don't know about like if we'll develop conventions on like common naming patterns for layers. Some people have started talking about that. I know Dave Rupert had an article, and Stephanie Eccles has a proposal on the layer names that she's trying to use across projects. I've been playing around and changing it project to project for my own work. I think one of the things that I often have to clarify to people is the difference between layers and scopes. I don't think it's particularly useful to say like we need a new layer for every component. Components are a scope, and layers are more like an intent that goes across scopes. So your button and your calendar both have defaults, So defaults is a layer that goes across all of the components. And there might be a components layer that says component styles override broader defaults, but utilities override components. So there might be a components layer. I don't think it's necessarily useful to have a layer per component. The other big thing to think about is the unlayered versus layered styles. How are you handling that? Are you moving everything into layers? And then finally, it changes how we think about importance. And this is maybe controversial, but importance was intended to balance the origins, balance power between authors and user preferences and browser defaults. Important is a way for the browser to say, some things are not only a default, they are required. So the browser can hit add important, and then you can't override that as a user or as an author. And otherwise, the browser styles are the least important. So browsers are at the bottom of normal styles, and they're at the top of important styles. So the order is flipped when you add importance. And the same is true with user preferences. So users can say, I would prefer that text be red. And we will generally override that. They will rarely see their preference. But they can also say, I insist that the text be red. And generally, they're not writing CSS. They're using a preference pane, but it's the same idea. They check a box and it adds importance. And suddenly their styles override ours, when usually ours win. And then we're in the middle. When we add importance, it doesn't go very far. We're still in the middle with users around and browsers at the top and bottom. So that's what importance was for, not really overriding other people in our space, not fighting with each other about specificity and trying to win over somebody else, but for protecting styles from a future layer. And that's how we've done it in Cascade Layers as well. So importance is there to protect styles that are important in a low layer so that they don't get overridden in a higher layer. An example of that might be the hidden attribute. We might, in our reset, say hidden attribute, anything with a hidden attribute should be display none. But that's in our reset, so it's pretty weak. And it's only an attribute style anyway, so again, pretty weak. But if we add important to that, we can keep it in that low layer. It's a broad default reset, but it's important. When the hidden attribute is applied, things should disappear. So we add important, and suddenly that jumps to the very top of the stack and protects that style from the components layer, accidentally overriding it by setting display grid on something. So learn that way of thinking about importance. If you're trying to resolve a conflict in specificity, that's what layers are for. But if you're trying to protect a style from future layers, that's what importance is for.
That is brilliant. And I will take a note of that. There's so many resources for learning about all these new CSS web techniques coming out. We will certainly include a whole boatload of links in our show notes. If you'd like to find those, you can go to oddbird.net/wingingit. If you want to hear more about what our team is working on and what we found interesting, then please come to oddbird.net/oddnews to sign up for our newsletter. The next episode of Winging It, we are going to feature HTMX. So I'm very excited to hear and learn more about that. Ed will be our expert on the next show. Do you want to preview anything here for us, Ed?
Yeah, I'd probably say if you wanted to do more with HTML, more user interaction, more just more dynamic behavior without having to go with a front-end JavaScript framework, I think you'll like HTMX. So that's what we're going to talk next time.
Sounds pretty awesome.
Yeah, sounds cool.
Send us topics that you're interested in, oddbird.net/contact. Please send us any examples of how you are currently using layers on your projects. And if you like this episode, please let us know. Like, subscribe, so that we have an idea of who's listening, watching, and what you want to hear more about. So thanks for joining us, everyone.